Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for the Bakunin Jurisdictional command. In this video, we'll be talking about who Bakunin are, how they play, what is their faction identity, as well as some of their limitations, before jumping into Infinity Army to go through some, but not all, of the profiles that really exemplify them and showcase what they can do. As always, these faction-focused videos just represent my own experience and takes. They are not universal, but in this case, particular thanks to Rob from Canberra. Rob took Bakunin to CanCon, that's Australia's satellite event, this year and won with it. And Rob was kind enough to reach out and provide some expertise and some takes, which have gone a long way in informing this video. So Rob, big thanks. And for those wondering, wait, there are two Robs from Canberra that play Infinity? No, there are three. And it's starting to get confusing. Also, as always, big thanks to the channel supporters who have requested topics like this one. This one goes out to, I believe it's pronounced Cyberknight, who made this request for either this or JSA. So Cyberknight, I hope you enjoy this. Here is your faction focus for Bakunin. As always, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member. Big thanks to everyone who has so far. Now, who are Bakunin? Setting aside the narrative, which you can read about elsewhere, and which personally I find quite compelling. I actually really like the anarchist sub-themes and overt themes of Bakunin. Bakunin are what I would call a modern sectoral, and they're one of only a few sectorals that really deserve that label, alongside, say, Morats and Torchlight Brigade. And what I would call a modern sectoral in this case is one where Corvus Belli has really embraced the design concept of not just being a riff on or a subset of the vanilla faction. Bakunin really stands alone as its own army, as its own play experience. It isn't just nomads with far more limited troop selections but access to links. Yes, it does have access to links, and those are a major part of how it plays and what it can accomplish, but it is a really fully complete, well-rounded faction that can do a great many things and offer a great many playstyles. It is far, far from one note, and in fact there are a ton of different ways that you can play Bakunin and strengths that you can lean into, which we'll talk about over the course of this video. This really thoroughly differentiates them from vanilla nomads and makes them either an excellent starting point if you wanted to collect nomads before branching out into vanilla, or if you play vanilla and want a thoroughly different play experience with relatively few model purchases. I really like this feature-complete sectoral design approach that Corvus Belli has been adopting for more recent sectorals, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing it continue in future. So noting that Bakunin are kind of a complete and modern sectoral, what does that mean they can do? Well, it kind of means that they can do just about anything if they absolutely need to. They have troops that can fulfill any of the needs you might see on a Infinity battlefield, but in particular they have what I would say are three main strengths. The first is that they have very good kind of middle to heavyweight links in the form of both the Observance links and Riot Girls, both of which we'll talk about extensively in the Infinity Army section. These links and a number of Haris teams that you can form with Bakunin all operate on a similar function, which is to take basically good troops on their own merits that have the Frenzy or Impetuous discount, and then link them to basically obviate that disadvantage while getting full benefit from usually pure composition links, which make for basically a great series of high-quality pure cores or pure Haris teams, as well as some like utility and warband teams. So Bakunin will always be playing with links. It is a very, very rare Bakunin list that is not bringing typically both a core and a Haris and sometimes a duo, and the faction makes excellent, excellent use of these. It's also notable that you can run your cores and your Haris teams in a variety of different configurations. There are at least 3 very capable different core setups, and there are a ton of capable Haris setups, all of which you will use and all of which make excellent use of Bakunin's different troops. This kind of gives you the ability to play Bakunin as a like Pano light faction, where yes, you kind of ballistic skill 13 is where you top out, but you've got pure core bonuses, so that firepower is heavily magnified, it's made stronger, it's able to compete in the firepower game, even if it isn't necessarily high watermark, it is very good as long as your links hold up. To complement that, Bakunin also have some of the most outstanding warbands that you will see in a sectoral in particular. They have access to a full, like a variety of different capable and differently costed warband profiles, mostly in the form of Morlocks and Zellenkriegers, but between the two of those you have 8-point, 6-point, and 12-point profiles, all of which can be made regular in a particular Haris team using the Taskmaster, but all of which are also good on their own merits. This kind of irregular trading piece was one of my favorite things to include in an army. It forms a really great, just solid defensive and offensive backbone. And Bakunin has it in not necessarily the very highest quality, but in really solid quality and quantity if it wants it, in addition to having the Uberfallkommando, which we will absolutely talk about down the line. Finally, they also have thoroughly solid, advanced deploying, midfield hacking, that kind of asymmetric warfare, nomad stuff. Very arguably, they probably fall behind vanilla in this capacity, but the point is that they still have access to all of those tools. They have access to midfield repeaters, they have access to solid hacking, they have access to pitches, they have access to mine layers and midfield pieces, including specialists. They tend to pay in some respects a little bit more, maybe have to pay for some bells and whistles, but because they have all of those tools, what that means is that you have in total a faction that can gunfight and ARO off the back of its links, trade with its asymmetric pieces and its warbands, and then play the asymmetric denial, midfield, camouflage, etc. game, all very capably. And this produces a faction that can be exceptionally well-rounded, but which also, the way that it wants to play, and this is something that Rob relayed to me, and is his experience, and which carried him to first place in our satellite event, is that Bakunin is a faction that leverages its strengths and plays basically rock, paper, scissors exceptionally well. You can play an info war and denial game when it's the best option. You can play an asymmetric warband and trading game when it's the best option. You can play big guns and heavy infantry when that's the best option. And you can mix and match all of these in a single list and play all of them over the course of a single game. So a Bakunin game might include something like beginning the game by trading with enemy disposable arrows using your warbands, clearing the way, to then lay down a hacking network and perhaps drop a missile on the enemy big gun, and then use your link models and ARO pieces for firepower superiority. If you are capable of using all of your different tools effectively into the situations where they are the best thing to have, Bakunin can deliver a very powerful, but more importantly, very complete and like tactically flexible play experience, which is super cool and super interesting, and something that we are seeing in these newer sectorals. Now, Bakunin does still come with some limitations. Just generally playing that kind of it does a bit of everything playstyle does mean that if you run into an opponent who's trying to do the same thing, the game can become very much a matter of who is able to better leverage their strengths into their opponent's weaknesses. And while those kind of games can be super close and super interesting and super fascinating, Bakunin isn't like clearly advantaged into them. Into a faction like, for example, Vanilla Combined Army, the gunfighting matchups are very close, the warband trading matchups are very close, and the hacking matchups maybe potentially are CA favored. And that segues into what I would call probably the next and largest limitation of Bakunin, which is that for all of the rock, paper, scissors that they have, they most dislike losing the hacking game. Bakunin hackers and network projection is capable, but it's just capable, like good, but it's not going to survive into an apex predator hacking enemy, or just an enemy that gets the jump on you in a very significant way. And when Bakunin lose the hacking game in particular, some of their other pieces can fall apart because they're taking linked heavy infantry, which can be very susceptible to any kind of hacking. And they're still nomads, which means that they have certain key, they're susceptible to having key pieces removed, which your opponent might be able to do with guided missiles. And although the Bakunin Warband game in particular can kind of help get you through a situation where you might lose the hacking game, that's probably one of the things that you most have to look out for and be most careful if you're playing with Bakunin, and where I personally have experienced a lot of success playing against Bakunin. So that is something that you need to consider and bear in mind, and potentially consider in terms of things like list construction and list pairings. What do you do if if you expect to run into an enemy that can not just out-hack you, but thoroughly like dominate the info war game? Finally, and this is something that I wouldn't have thought of, but which Rob noted, and I think is a very interesting point, Bakunin is very easy to make lists with that they struggle with command token expenditure, in particular running out of command token quickly. Bakunin have a lot of ways to reconstitute their forces. They have access to very capable, linkable doctors and engineers, which you'll be re-rolling on your remote presence structure models or your models with cubes. Bakunin want to take a lot of irregulars, and often you'll be converting those irregulars into regular orders if you don't have something to do with them that turn. Bakunin take a lot of fire teams, and because they take a lot of fire teams, that will occasionally mean needing to reform those fire teams. And then finally, in this ITS season, we have O12 Prestige. And so collectively, that puts a lot of demand on Bakunin's command tokens, which you have to manage very carefully. It is very easy to run out, and among other things, that means that if you have a loss of lieutenant situation, really Bakunin has no way of dealing with that. Now, Bakunin is quite capable of just taking some lieutenants and having them be decoys. That's totally fine. They're not going to set the world on fire, but they will just hide and you'll try and keep them safe. But it is, again, something to look out for and something if you're playing against Bakunin to potentially exploit. You can stress their command token usage. It means that if you can break a link, maybe by using Oblivion on a HI link leader, those command tokens are going to be proportionally a little bit more precious for Bakunin, which means that it's an opening that you can potentially utilize. So overall, Bakunin are a versatile, narratively and tactically interesting faction with a great deal of complexity, different play options, and different list construction tools, which makes them, frankly, really, really cool. It was not a huge surprise to see them pick up an event like CanCon, going undefeated over 5 rounds, particularly with a player like Rob at the helm who is both exceptional and very well practiced. Rob is a ride or die Nomad player and a long-time Bakunin player in particular, and congratulations to Rob for winning CanCon, Australia's satellite event. Now, let's jump into Infinity Army and start going through the many profiles that we have to cover to talk about Bakunin. Now, we're going to start by talking about Bakunin's 2 core primary Fireteam core and some tertiary Fireteam core options before we move on into other things the faction can do. The core Fireteams in Bakunin are very strong and very varied, as noted, and the first one we're going to talk about is the Observance Fireteam. Now, an Observance Fireteam needs a model with Reverend in its name, a Reverend healer, Moira, or Custodia, but you're taking Observance Fire teams for the Reverend Cenobites. Oh, they're called Reverend Cenobites. Never mind, it just says Cenobite there. Anyway, you're taking Reverence Fire teams for Cenobites. Cenobites are some of the best and scariest linkable impetuous HI, thanks to Mimetism -6 and basically a fine selection of weapon loadouts. Now, these are just ballistic skill 11, which means that if you're taking linked shooting with them, you're going to be rolling 14s at best with a full core. But Mimetism 6 overcomes a tremendous quantity of sins when it comes to the ability to gunfight, and Cenobites are well set up for that. On top of the Mimetism 6, we have Solid Martial Arts, CC22, basically good close combat, Armor and BTS 3, 2 wounds in a faction, and including a link that can have quite capable doctors, and Impetuous to heavily discount them, which you will then chuck them into a link to get full effect out of. They also have 6-2 movement, although it's worth noting that they will be chained quite frequently to 4-4 models, so there is a limit to how much you can take advantage of that. It is nevertheless nice, particularly when using them for close assault. Now, there are 2 main profiles that you will typically take if you're taking Reverend Cenobites, and in Bakunin, if you have an Observance link, you will be taking Reverend Cenobites. The first is the Chain Rifle +1 burst, Heavy Pistol +1 burst. That wins out over the Light Shotgun, basically because of the Chain Rifle Heavy Pistol combo compared to the Light Shotgun combo, and the Heavy Pistol in particular can be used in CC as a +1 burst CC weapon. This is your go-to Cenobite for close assault, where in a core link, it will be firing 3 bursts of chain rifle or 4 bursts of heavy pistol. Yes, only base ballistic skill 11, but that typically will be up to 14. And if you're rounding a corner, you have your Mimetism, the enemy's out of cover. That is a very, very good model for just going in and clearing enemy problems out at close range. At longer range, we then have the Heavy Rocket Launcher Light Shotgun. This has a light shotgun, that's fantastic, but really you are playing this for the heavy rocket launcher. This is one of the 2 best ARO pieces in Bakunin alongside the Riot Girl missile launcher. Being burst 2 base, a heavy rocket launcher is a capable weapon both for active shooting and ARO. Burst 3 BS14 is certainly good enough to make use of basically the gunfighting profile when you have Mimetism 6, provided you've kept that core link in full effect, and basically this gives you your one of a few, but definitely one of the primary gunfighting platforms in the Observance link generally, and Bakunin in general. Now, it is a little challenging to spam Cenobite HRLs, as attractive as it would be to do so, because like most Nomad factions, Bakunin SWC is in relatively high demand, but if you are taking an Observance link as the core of your Bakunin list, you should include a Cenobite HRL alongside basically as part of your core, alongside typically at least one other Cenobite, and then some other Observance pieces. So typically an Observance core will be formed around either a Moira or a Custodia as the piece that makes it legal to play that, one or more of those pieces, and you can certainly include multiple. Moiras are, I would describe them as thoroughly serviceable, particularly now that they have Frenzy, although I would note that, frankly, Frenzy is a rule that hurt Moiras in vanilla Nomads, even though it helps them plenty by giving them a points discount in Bakunin. That was a change when the Bakunin Sector was reworked. Now, Moiras they have some strict limitations, and that is that they are an Armor 3 BTS 0, 1 wound troop. They're just medium infantry. They rely on their Mimetism 6 and hopefully boosted ballistic skill from the Link team to survive and win gunfights. And that means that they are susceptible both to 1, bad luck, just losing a face-to-face roll, getting crit by a random combi, or anything that rounds a corner against them with a template weapon. A Libertos with a light shotgun coming around the corner is a serious problem for Moiras. Now, they can attempt a dodge, knowing that the Libertos is going to struggle to hit them with hit mode, but they're only dodging on 12s. 12s is better than many medium infantry, but you do have to really think about how you're going to keep models like Moiras and Custodias safe. Now, if you are taking a Moira, typically it's going to be one of the gunfighting options. The heavy machine gun gives you very, very high burst, along with decent ballistic skill 15, that's quite good in a big core link, and NCO, meaning that you can spend the lieutenant order productively, and you often won't otherwise do that in Bakunin, so NCO is a valuable skill. Or the multi-sniper rifle, kind of just doing the same thing at much longer range bands with armor-piercing or double-action rounds. It, alongside the Cenobite HRL, are both viable options for attempting to engage things like enemy heavy armor, for example. A Panoshianian Squarlaws doesn't particularly want to take a gunfight with either of those in their active turn, because it's going to only be hitting on 9s, they'll be hitting on 14s or 15s, and actually vulnerable to the attacks that they'll be putting out against it. Now, if you aren't taking a Moira to unlock the core, and you certainly aren't taking a Reverend Healer to unlock the core, we will not be touching those, they're not particularly good, you'll be taking a Reverend, one or more Reverend Custodias. And these are the hacking Reverend pieces in the Observance link, and they are capable, but they are an example of a piece that is paying for bells and whistles that perhaps they would like to leave behind if they had the option. If you compare a Reverend Custodia to something like, say, a Hassassin Barid in Hack Islam or Hassassin's, you have, frankly, broadly capable hacking and the same picture capability for literally twice the price. Now, is that fair? Is that reasonable? Well, Reverend Custodies are getting some extra things, and they are making your entire fire team viable, so that's kind of just a price that you occasionally have to pay, and certainly, Barids are the most efficient hacker in the entire game for their cost. Being more expensive than them does not make you a bad hacker. Reverend Custodies, however, are expensive. For their cost, though, you get some very, very solid things that in particular are solid in a pure core linked, which is something that the Barids will never have access to. So for our price, we get, yes, a ballistic skill 12, mimetism -6, combi rifle armed. I'm going to say gunfighter in kind of air quotes. A Reverend Custodia can, if they need to, both survive and engage with the combi rifle, but it's not what you're bringing them for, and you'll probably have better pieces in your list to do that. But it does kind of make them just a little more resilient to emergency, unexpected gunfire that you hope not to have to take, or it's like late in the game and you're sitting on an objective and everyone just has to survive. Mimetism 6 is always a very good, it's like a very good skill. It's just not a piece that you would put on a hacker if you were seeking to optimize it. However, ballistic skill 12 pitches, whip 14, BTS 3 is totally serviceable, and a selection of high quality hacking devices, including killer hacking devices plus, which is very nice to have access to. Remember that if you're playing these Reverend Custodians, you probably have a full link team that all has Mimetism 6, which means that being able to lay down white noise is very nice indeed. And you also have the option of a hacking device with Carbonite +1 burst. That's probably going to be the least commonly taken one, if only because we have another model elsewhere in the faction that has an upgraded Carbonite program that we'll probably be taking instead. Now, for my money, Reverend Custodians are some of my favorite models to base a Bakunin Observance core link around, even if it's just the killer hacker. And in the list that we show off at the end of the video, we'll actually see 2 of these as the basis for a legal Observance core link. Now, finally, rounding out the Observance core link, we have Mother Healer Agatha Wabara. She is the reason why you do not take Reverend Healers, because she is just far, far better. Medikit +1 burst, no wounding cap and shock immune, great close combat, martial arts 2 with CC22 and an explosive CCW, Mimetism 6, and just some absolutely killer gunfighting with ballistic skill 13, which makes her the highest ballistic skill in the entire Observance link, going up to 16 in a pure core, with your choice of Breaker Combi Rifle and Pulsar or Vulcan Shotgun. Both of those are great choices. It will really just depend on what else you're taking in the link in terms of things you have access to for close assault. I would personally observe that I think the Breaker Combi Rifle tends to round out an Observance link just slightly better. But you will never hear me say a bad word about Vulcan shotguns. Both of these are excellent. It just depends on what you want to use the link for and what you have the points for. Agatha Wabara is an outstanding piece. She rounds out the Observance core very, very well. Just super strong. Admittedly, you do get what you pay for in this case, as she's nearly 40 points. Now, on the other side of the coin, to the Mimetism 6 heavy, super powerful core link, we have the Multispectral Visor heavy, super powerful core link, starting around Riot Girls. Now, there are actually a couple of ways to get Riot Girls into a core link, but we're going to start by just talking about the Riot Girl Pure Core, which begins obviously with Riot Girls. Riot Girls have always been one of the, basically forever, right? They have been one of the premier HI links, and with the Bakunin rework, the options you had for that Fireteam core expanded out kind of like quite pleasingly to the point where there are now a few really interesting configurations. But they will start with 5 Riot Girl or equivalent pieces. And Riot Girls have Frenzy, but don't have any meaningful close combat stats, which means that the Frenzy discount is just applied entirely and in full, which is very good, which means that for what you are paying, Riot Girls are an extraordinarily efficient piece. You get 6-2 move, Ballistic Steel 13, Fizz 13, dodging on 16s, Whip 13, Arm 3, BTS 3, 2 wounds. Like, nothing there is outstanding, but at the price point, those are excellent. On top of that, they've got Ballistic Skill attack +1 damage, which really helps when you are using something like, say, a Spitfire and makes the missile launcher truly fearsome, and a Multispectral Visor level 1, which in Infinity N4 is an outstanding piece to have, because enemy cannot throw smoke grenades, regular smoke grenades, to get past it. They must use either white noise or eclipse grenades. This means that particularly the Riot Girl core linked, basically the core linked Riot Girl has been one of the apex ARO pieces for as long as it has existed, and that is still true today. You can slap one of those bad girls up on a high place, watching as much of the table as you can, and there is always a chance that she will just carry the game for you, unless your opponent really has quite specific tools to move around her. Now, as usual, my recommendation for a piece like that, and if we think about the context in which Bakunin plays, is you want to use your big guns when your big guns are the best thing for you to use. Do not just always default to putting her up on ARO duty, because there are some things that can threaten her, but the option and having that option exist can be very strong, very powerful, really carry you through, particularly the early part of a game and even the late part of a game if you manage to put down enemy dominant firepower pieces. Otherwise, you'll make good use out of other elements. The Riot Girl Spitfire, going up to damage 15, really puts it over a threshold to be able to engage heavier targets. And at burst 5, either Ballistic Skill 13 or 14 or 16, depending on how big your link is and if the link is pure, and it typically will be. A thoroughly capable gunfighter with the MSV, etc. You'll also occasionally use the Tinbot boarding shotgun profiles, the multi-rifle, the specialist option, specialist operative combo rifle Blitzen. These are all just good and solid, particularly at the price, but it is usually the SWC pieces that will be the star players. Now, there are 2 other pieces that are very significant to note, particularly in the context of pure Riot Girl fire teams, and these, I believe, were both added as pure core options when the faction was reworked. The first of those is Avicenna. Avicenna is the best doctor in the game. There's no 2 ways about it. She's rolling on 18s, and she has her own no wound incapacitation, although to note, not shock immune. She is an outstanding specialist at Whip 15, and she can keep up with Riot Girls. And I mentioned before, Bakunin has a variety of ways to perform force reconstitution to bring things back. Avicenna is one of those. She doctors exceptionally well. She's got passable medkit at range if she's linked. She's a little bit cheaper than most Riot Girls, and she still contributes to full composition bonuses, which means you can slap her into a 5-person core without limiting the core at all and adding an absolute ton of capability. Having her ready to pick up your Riot Girl Spitfire, your Riot Girl missile launcher can be very, very strong. Big recommend. Avicenna doesn't see play in a lot of the factions she can be taken in, which admittedly is not that many, but in Bakunin, in a Riot Girl core, very solid. Equally solid and also a pure core piece is Fiddler FTO. Fiddler has Super Jump in as the FTO bonus, which you will use occasionally, but the main thing is that she is a pure Riot Girl core for purposes of your composition bonuses, which means in a 3-person link you'll get the Discover bonus, in a 5-person link you'll get everything, and she is a Whip 14 engineer, which is a ton of basically solid stuff. She's got drop bear, she's got decharges, she's a character, she's an engineer, she's got the linked gizmo kit. She's even surprisingly capable in close combat, and again, that 28-point version is the same cost as most of your Riot Girls, while being equally durable. She does have shock immune, which means that she can do things like a copper mine and then have Avicenna patch her back up, and she is a little faster than all of the other Riot Girls, but that's just nice to have. Now, normally you would say, hey, is there that much benefit to having an engineer in like a core link or a Haris? When what am I going to do? I guess I'm going to fix up hacking penalties that have been applied to my riot girls. Like, yes, you can do that, but there are a lot of things in Bakunin that just kind of randomly have structure, and the ability to drive by engineer or gizmo kit those. Some of them have very high fizz. You'll see when we get to them. Having that as a just as a piece that you've slapped into even a Haris team gives you random roving force reconstitution at frankly a very affordable cost, given you're trying to build just a solid core link. Being able to respond to literally any downed casualty in your entire army, whether it has structure or wounds, would generally be a nice to have, but in Bakunin is a particularly big deal because there is such a mix of both structure and wounds across the faction. So one of the favorite link teams that I have in Bakunin, and which I think we will see in the sample list when we get to that at the end, is just a little 3-person core of a Riot Girl Spitfire, Fiddler, and Avicenna. That gives you durability, good gunfighting, outstanding quality specialists, and the ability to respond to any downed model and get it back up. That is just super cool at about 30 points per model average. Yes, that's expensive, but it is very affordable, particularly in the context of the rest of the faction. Now, we won't jump to the profiles, but a couple of other things just to point out is that you can put Uhahu in particular in a Haris team. You don't want her to be in a Riot Girl core because she will break the composition bonuses, but that doesn't matter as much in a Haris, and she is a serviceable hacker, although typically speaking, I think you'll be reaching elsewhere for hackers in Bakunin, but if you wanted to take Oahu, certainly she's not a bad choice. And then finally, we have moderators. Now, moderators are notable as being typically your lieutenant will be a moderator almost always. Like there are other choices, but it's 9 points. It costs no SWC. Corregidor, eat your heart out. You just take 2 of these, you put them in different corners of the battlefield, you just hide them as best you can. One of them is the LT. We're done here. That's basically fine. Moderators also make serviceable hackers, and you can make one a paramedic. And what I'm getting at is that if you want a much cheaper fire team core, moderators are the way to go about it. Now, you're not going to get composition bonuses, but if you wanted to slap a Riot Girl into this link, you can do so. That is legal. It'll only be Ballistic Skill 14 at best, but that's still totally fine. And you can also do things like include Clockmakers and Vostoks. Now, that's much better suited at that point to something like a roving Haris team, which is legal. You have the Vostok, maybe you support wear it, you've got a Clockmaker just behind it. It's the kind of team that has fallen out of fashion a little bit in more recent times since the rework because the Observance and Riot Girl links are just so effective and self-contained and get pure composition bonuses, etc. But there is nothing wrong with, as a sort of secondary concept, trying to do things where you have more independent, expensive pieces. You want a cheaper core, a moderator core with whatever you want to put in it. Thoroughly serviceable, very effective, and very cheap because those moderators are just 9 points. Also to note, just randomly, moderators from Bakunin have one of my favorite profiles in terms of you can see the fluff reflected in them. Para CCW -6 and CC18 makes these guys randomly the sneakiest, most difficult things for their cost to kill in close combat, which I think fits wonderfully with Bakunin's broad theme. These are the definition of the "Sir, this is a Wendy's" general law enforcement mood, and every time I play against my local Bakunin players, we almost always have some kind of a situation where one of these things is wrestling some kind of CC horror to the ground that I've thrown into close combat with it, and that is just another day in the life of Rowdy Bakunin. Now, from our chunky high-end links, we're going all the way down the bottom end of the point scale to our cheap and effective warbands, and Bakunin is blessed with an absolute plethora of options here, starting with the ubiquitous Demolok group. Do not at me in the comments for my pronunciation of that. I know it's German. I cannot possibly manage this. Morlocks are one of basically another long-standing, excellent warband piece with a couple of viable profiles, both of which I particularly like. Generally speaking, if you're taking these, you're taking one of the 6-point options, and the 2 preferred 6-point options from me are either the Chain Rifle, Smoke Grenade, and EM-CCW, or the Chain Rifle, Smoke Grenade, and Assault Pistol AP-CCW options. These guys otherwise are pretty standard warbands. CT23, Martial Arts 2, that is good enough to win a close combat fight against just regular old non-martial arts experts. Whipped 14 is actually reasonably nice in terms of doing things like making discover rolls, which is often something that you want your like aggressively forward-moving things to do. Part of the role of Morlocks is to trip up enemy asymmetric pieces and camouflage markers and clear the way for your other pieces. Whip 14 is nice to have there. And, Fizz 13, etc. That's all basically just solid stats. Ballistic Skills 11 is notable. Many warbands would not have that. And even though they're impetuous, part of the reason why I like the Assault Pistol profile so much is in combination with that BS11. The fact that you can make a ballistic skill attack when you impetuous has led for me, particularly in vanilla nomads, but also in Bakunin, to an astounding number of situations where I just take a shot, like I just impetuous, move 4 inches, take a gunfight at 12, 13, 16 inches, and rolling 4 dice just carries you through it. There are plenty of occasions where that comes up when you are making particularly turn 2, turn 3 impetuous moves, which makes the assault pistol just like really, really solid. If, however, you plan to get into close combat, the EMCW is the way to go. Electromagnetic weapons are just basically the best close combat weapons in the game, and having access to them for just 6 points on Morlocks is outstanding. Finally, Morlocks have metachemistry, and there are a lot of metachemistry models in Bakunin. Metachemistry is thoroughly a nice to have. It's not something that you can particularly plan around, but particularly in N4, there are basically no bad rolls on that chart. Fortunately, Morlocks are good on their own merits even without Metachem, but basically anything you get will be a solid bonus. Really the only kind of mediocre roll is BTS plus 6. That is typically not going to do a ton, but every now and again it'll be awesome because you'll fire into a viral or a pulsar weapon and just tank through it. But most of the time you'll be rolling something that is basically okay, plus fizz, regeneration, extra movement, like movement skills, all of those things are great to have. You just don't know what you get until you've deployed them, so it's difficult to really plan around what the effect is. Nevertheless, nice to have, bit of bookkeeping required. Generally, Morlocks are one of the outstanding and most well-rounded warbands in the game, particularly off the back of the assault pistol. Morlocks alongside Zellenkriegers are also linkable with the Taskmaster Heavy Infantry. Taskmasters, which we'll just put on screen now, are a little expensive for what you get. Ultimately, you get a BS-13 HI with a variety of serviceable weapons. There's a lot of bells and whistles on the Taskmaster that makes them kind of difficult to recommend alone. You're paying for, not quite good enough close combat. Your stealth is fine, it's nice to have. You're paying for deployment zone mine layer with things like shock mines and crazy koalas. Again, not bad, just nice to have. Nothing outstanding, particularly on a BS-13 HI, but ultimately they are affordable, and if you link them with Morlocks or Zellenkriegers, you turn those irregular impetuous models into regular non-impetuous models. And that produces a very capable fire team that is thoroughly discounted because, basically, despite the cost of the Taskmaster, because you are paying 6 or 8 points for his buddies, and all of those are regular and can gunfight and can throw smoke, it's collectively a very effective little team, albeit one that is difficult to include a specialist in. You must include a Taskmaster, and because you're including a Taskmaster, you usually want to take 2 of the models that he turns regular, and you're not running that as a core. I don't think it's even legal to do so. No, it's not. It's duo or ace only. So yeah, nice to have, cool little option. But even if you don't take a Taskmaster, all of the irregular warband pieces in Bakunin are still outstanding. Now, the next of those to talk about is the Zellenkrieger and Extreme Zellenkrieger. These are the newest warbands in Bakunin and in the game generally, and they are solid. They give you a lot more, particularly CC focus compared to the Morlock, which has its assault pistol and therefore is a bit more well-rounded. Lower ballistic skill on the Zellenkrieger. Strictly speaking, not actually better close combat, but they have Berserk and Natural Born Warrior CC attack -3, which means that they are better suited at going into close combat against enemy martial artists, particularly if you are taking the heavy pistol +1 burst version, which can be used better in close combat because it's got the extra burst in CC. Like the Morlocks, these guys have metachemistry, but they have metachemistry reroll, which means you have a much better chance of rolling out of something that you don't want and into something that you do. Although my usual advice is not to get greedy there, because pretty much all of the metachemistry options are pretty good. Whether you take Zellenkriegers or Morlocks is going to be down to things like points and personal preference, although to note, Zellenkriegers have structure, whereas Morlocks have wounds, so if you've taken engineers but not doctors, or doctors but not engineers, that can help steer your decision in that respect. Alongside Zellenkriegers, we have the Extreme Zellenkriegers, which are Silhouette 5, and basically lose metachemistry for a variety of guaranteed stat buffs. Otherwise, very similar weapon loadouts. They've got Fizz 15, rather than Fizz 13, they dodge a little further, they cost 1 point more. You take Extreme Zellenkriegers, basically, do you have 1 point spare? Do you have 1 point spare? It's a serviceable upgrade. Silhouette 5 is kind of sometimes good and sometimes bad. Fizz 15 is just if you want smoke throwing, Fizz 15 is just pleasingly reliable, whereas the regular Zellenkrieger would have to roll to find something that would otherwise, basically, if a regular Zellenkrieger rolls well on the chart, they'll typically outperform an Extreme Zellenkrieger. If they don't, the Extreme Zellenkrieger will be a little bit better. They cost virtually the same. The Extreme Zellenkrieger is only 1 point more. Finally, our third Zellenkrieger super friend is Den McConnelly, and he is a 12-point regular Zellenkrieger that does have Martial Arts 1, and who gets both the heavy pistol +1 burst and a +1 burst chain rifle rather than just a 1 burst pulsar that you would see on the Zerlenkriegers. He also gets 6-2 move, which is particularly nice. At 12 points, Denmark Connolly, I think, is something of a sometimes food, because fundamentally what he is doing is just all of the same things that any other 1 wound warband does. You take him if either you need the regular order, which is very relevant. I mentioned before that command tokens in Bakunin were something that you could find as a bit of a stressor. Denma being regular basically makes it easy to include him if you are already kind of at capacity there. Admittedly, at a 150% of the cost of a Zellenkrieger and at twice the cost of a Morlock, he will not necessarily perform at 150% or 200% the effectiveness of one of those pieces. But he's regular, you can fit him in when you wouldn't otherwise put things into a list. He represents, say, a 4th warband piece that you couldn't otherwise include because you simply would be running too many irregulars for your personal comfort zone. So just broadly, very solid, will perform well, is totally fine, is not that expensive that you really need to worry about it, usually can find those 4 points. And he makes an excellent warband to include if you want more pieces in your list like that after you've already taken, say, 2 or 3 the Morlock group and Zellenkriegers. And finally, in terms of warbands, the warband of warbands, the big kahuna, the Bakunin Uberfallkommando. I'm honestly not exactly sure where to start with her, because if you've played against a Bakunin Uberfallkommando, you know that, look, she can be a little feast or famine, but when she goes off, she is just one of the most revolting things in the entire game. She does need to be carried a little bit, because before anything else, let's recognize impetuous, 1 wound, 1 structure. No BTS. You hit her with literally anything, she will fail her save, go unconscious, and then the entire module falls apart because she is a synchronized trooper module, etc. However, if you keep the fragile Chimera herself alive, by God, what a profile. Oh, and you can take 3 of these in Bakunin if you wanted to. Usually don't. 1 or 2 is the correct number, but if you wanted to, you could take 3 Chimeras and 9 Pupniks, which is a statement. Now, what do you get for the price that you're paying? You're paying 20 points for the full loadout, down to 17 if you just take the Chimera. Do not just take the Chimera. Always take the Chimera with 3 if possible, 2 if not possible, Pupniks. The Chimera herself has a combi rifle nanopulsar, eclipse grenades at Phys 13, which is serviceable, and a viral CCW. And the complaint-inducing combination of CC24, Martial Arts Level 2, and Natural Born Warrior, on top of which she has CC Attack -3, which makes her basically the best close combatant in the entire game, if you look past the fact that she has a single wound and cannot afford to fail a save. She will almost always be rolling on 27s, and your opponent will always be rolling just about on less than 20, which makes it very difficult for her to lose a face-to-face roll, even before we get into the burst bonuses that will be supplied by the Pupniks. Now, Pupniks are the reason why the Chimera, despite everything that she has, Pupniks are the reason why the Chimera absolutely pops off. She and they have climbing plus and 6-4 movement. They dodge like absolute bastards. They are only CC 19 in close combat, but they have DA CCWs, and it doesn't matter because they cost 1 point. You can take 3 of them synchronized to the Chimera, and they cost 1 point. You can literally just put these things in the open, and the time and orders that it takes your opponent to put down each individual Pupnik is not efficient for them relative to the cost of the Pupnik. They are literally the best value for cost in the entire game, and the only thing that keeps Pupniks remotely fair and reasonable is that ultimately they are shackled to a single wound Chimera. Now, all of that would be good on its own merits, but we need to talk about how synchronized models work in close combat, because that is how you get to the high watermark of what the Chimera can accomplish. When you get close combats happening with synchronized troops, each individual close combat that is occurring, so let's say, for example, that there are 2 Fusiliers, and you have moved the Chimera and 1 Pupnik into CC with 1 Fusilier, and you've moved 2 Pupniks into CC with the other Fusilier. In each of those individual close combats, when you declare CC attack, you will have to choose one of your models engaged in the close combat to make the attacks, but it will get a burst bonus for each model of yours that is in close combat. And you decide that as your second short skill, which means that your opponent has to declare their actions before they know who they will be engaging, which means that you have not just incredible close combat, because by God, the Chimera with extra burst, but you get effectively a kind of pseudo berserk with none of the restrictions on declaring berserk, because if you don't want something to be a close combat, you just choose to declare your attacks with a model that your opponent didn't ARO against. So in that example that we've given, well, let's say your opponent shoots the Chimera. The Chimera will make that a face-to-face roll because she's going to win trivially, so she just cuts the throat of the Fusilier that she's engaging with no issues whatsoever. But in the other face-to-face roll, you might decide, oh, okay, look, the Fusilier is combi rifling against one of these Pupniks. I'm going to have the Pupnik that he didn't shoot make the attacks, which means that those rolls now aren't face-to-face. The Fusilier shoots a 1-point Pupnik, and the other 1-point Pupnik inflicts 2 Fuse 13 DA hits on him and annihilates him. And congratulations, in a single order, you've just killed 2 pieces. And it's this kind of play, along with the extreme speed, extreme mobility, access to Eclipse, etc., that makes, if you can just keep the Chimera herself alive, makes this setup the most dangerous warband and close combat assault setup in the entire game relative to its cost. Now, Pupniks have wounds, but the Chimera has structure, which means that if you have engineers, you will use them to recover the Chimera. And one of the things that Rob notes is that there is really nothing more demoralizing for your opponent than managing to put like a combi rifle ARO somehow into a Chimera, and you just picking her back up with something like a Burst 3 Gizmo kit from a Clockmaker or a Burst 2 Gizmo kit from Fiddler. At Fizz 13, Gizmo kits into things like Chimeras and Zellenkriegers is highly effective. So, pause for breath. Okay, what have we covered? Big, powerful link teams, super effective warbands, including some of the best CC warbands in the entire game. What else does Bakunin have? Bakunin has midfield and repeater projection. Okay, so the initiated observance is, these are pieces that, look, frankly, they are not that expensive. They are affordable, not egregiously affordable, like they're not undercosted, but you get solidly what you pay for with these pieces. The parachutist versions are totally fine, and they add some parachutist to Bakunin, which otherwise has very, very limited access to drop troops. Now it has some, and they're totally okay. You'll typically take the killer hacking device if you need a specialist. It has boarding shotguns and decharges, mimetism 3, BS12. Nothing to dislike there, particularly stealth is nice. Being medium infantry opens up some classifieds as well, although they are spec trained, not veteran troops. You have no shortage of veteran troops elsewhere in the list though. More common is that you will see some initiated observance with camouflage. It's only one use, but it's still camouflage, and it's mimetism 3 camouflage. That's going to be very important. Infiltration, and either just a boarding shotgun, probably not. More commonly, you will have the mine layer submachine gun deployable repeater. Now, the SMG is a fine weapon here for ambush use at close range against more heavily armored pieces or for going into suppressive fire. Ultimately, this piece is 21 points, and most of what you are paying for is a deployable repeater in the midfield. Now, how does this compare to the ubiquitous regular Nomad Masai Moran? It is more expensive, it does not come with a crazy koala, it is no better at gunfighting. In fact, I would argue that it is worse. I would rather have the Masai Moran boarding shotgun over a submachine gun. But there is a big difference between having your piece that generates orders under a camouflage marker and the repeater just on a rooftop somewhere being silhouette nothing, tucked behind any old parapet that will accommodate it. Your opponent is incentivized to go after the repeater because that's what's going to be interfering with their advance, letting you spotlight and carbonite and oblivion them as they move forward. And when they go after and kill that repeater, they have not killed your piece that laid the repeater in the first instance, and which is generating your precious orders. Now, yes, the Masai Moran is also a specialist, blah, blah, blah. Masai Morans are excellent, right? But what the Initiative Observants give you is something that is quite close to that capability in a faction that also has link teams and its own strengths, etc., and that is very important. And on top of that, because you have them infiltrating under a Mimetism 3 camouflage marker, you get genuine fog of war alongside zeros. Now, zeros are the most basic of basic infiltrators in the entire game, and that is totally fine. Cheap, cheerful, and effective is the way to go for these pieces, and if you have like 1 or 2 initiated observances and 1 or 2 zeros, you actually have a thoroughly populated, powerful, annoying to attack midfield because you have deployable repeaters from the observance models, you have shock mines with mine layer from the 0.5 SWC, and 20 points at AVA 3 for the mine layer zeros is thoroughly affordable. And there are some wonderful other zero profiles as well. The KHD is great if you want a cheap specialist that can contribute some things to the game. Otherwise, the 19-point boarding shotgun shock mines is just another general use assault piece. The boarding shotgun goes a long way in covering up the fact that the zeros just have ballistic skill 11. Even the EM mine profile with the deployable repeaters is worth considering in some cases if you have the spare points. Generally though, with zeros, I would be leaning towards mine layers, the killer hacker, and the boarding shotgun, but frankly all of these profiles can be used in some capacity, and that is particularly important because what it means is that when your opponent is confronted by 3, 4, 5 camouflage markers in the midfield playing against Bakunin, they'll be able to make some deductions about what those camouflage markers are hiding. If there's a deployable repeater in the open, one of them will be an initiated observant. But beyond that, it's difficult for them to know for sure exactly what is what, particularly if you also have a zero mine layer and your camouflage markers are sort of mutually supporting. That is that kind of bare minimum effective fog of war for camouflage play that makes camouflage play effective. Now, are Bakunin as good at this as something like Ariadna, for example? No, absolutely not. But they are good enough. And being good enough at this kind of play, in addition to having the warbands, in addition to having the HI links, in addition to having the hacking when you have network projection in the midfield, that is a powerful and robust combination that you play all types of the game. And adding into that mix, while we are talking about midfield repeater projection, we should also mention Robin Hook Outlaw AI. She is a thoroughly eclectic, they are a thoroughly eclectic profile, but what they boil down to is a bunch of kind of cool stuff and very effective network projection. So, what do they do overall? Well, they have climbing plus and super jump on a 6-2 profile. So they are very mobile, particularly with forward deployment +4 to give them a bit of a head start. And they are a repeater and they have stealth. And what that means is that under their own power, they can sneak forward using stealth to move that repeater into range of something that your opponent so something that you want to hack of your opponents without, unless your opponent has Sixth Sense, any way to react. That then gives you total carte blanche to conduct your hacking and info war game, which is very, very useful. Now, obviously, Sixth Sense is something of a counter to her, and because she is HI, she is hackable. So if you are going after enemy hackers, you are not, for example, going to want to move her after enemy hackers with Sixth Sense because they could Oblivion her, but she still has the ability to dodge into that repeater area range if that's what you really needed to do. It's just not an ideal use case. She's also robust. She's got effectively 2 wounds. She goes into that battle ravage state where she keeps most of what is important about her, and she has guns and stuff. Like, look, nothing. I'm not setting the world on fire with a +1 damage BS11 rifle or a +3 ballistic skill tactical bow, or the heavy pistols, etc. That's just stuff. But the drop bears are pretty nice and do synergize nicely with the role that she's got. You can lay those drop bears defensively. You can use them to protect her position, or you can throw drop bears and then move into the enemy's zone of control, looking to establish the repeater network, and then begin hacking, knowing that if the enemy resets, they will trigger the mine. It's order intensive, but it's a particularly nasty combination. And at 23 points, she's broadly pretty affordable for what she does. You don't put her in every list, but if you want to splash some hacking into your list, and you've already taken, like maybe you couldn't afford, or you've already taken an initiated observance, you've got pitches, etc., she just rounds out the ability to network project. If you are putting your Reverend Custodies in your fire team on one part of the table, Robin Hook then can go on a different part of the table to give you some nice coverage. Stuff like that. She is going to be somewhat vulnerable because she doesn't have a camouflage marker or any way to enter into a marker state, and she does have to move up the midfield, which takes orders, but she moves very efficiently, very mobilely, and there are a lot of ways to use a piece like that. On top of that, she has Booty, which just occasionally... Booty is a bit more of a mercurial chart than Metachemistry. Metachemistry typically exists on models that want to do one thing, and it facilitates that one thing, whereas Booty will just randomly give her a sniper rifle some game, grenades another, a DACC weapon some other games, which she will never in a million years use, unless it's like an anti-materiel scenario, and then you'll get that one game where she gets +4 armor, and your opponent has to go after her with combi rifles, and it's just torturous. So overall, she is a piece that straddles that line between fun and effective very well, and she certainly fits into competitive Bakunin lists if you're so inclined. Now, finally, as we move towards the end of the video, we're going to talk about some of the spicier pieces or things to consider. And we're going to start that with the spiciest tag in the game, the Stigmata of the Observance. Now, this was a piece that, when it came out with the re-release of Bakunin, kind of everyone went, oh, and wasn't sure exactly what to think, because there is a lot going on here. In basically the same week, you saw takes that's like, this thing is incredibly OP and disgusting, and takes that were like, I can Trinity this tag to death. That's terrible. Why would you take this? And indeed, the Stigmata embodies multitudes. So what do we have here? What we have a 6/4 Silhouette 6 tag, which is one of the nicest basically places to sit in terms of that nice mix of mobility and silhouette. It's Ballistic Skill 13, CC 20, which is surprisingly good. Not really a CC model, but nice to have. Fizz 14, Whip 13, Armor 6, BTS 6. It has ECM Guided -6, but much more importantly, it has ECM Hacker -3 and a hacking device. So this is not a tag whose pilot is a hacker. This is a tag that is a hacker, Whip 13, ECM, and BTS 6 with Carbonite +2 damage. It's got all of the other usual suite of tag stuff, and importantly is a remote presence tag, which makes it very easy to repair, provided you have an engineer and access to command tokens. For weapons, it has a HRL +1 burst, an EMCCW, and heavy flamethrower +1 burst, which burst 3, BS13 is okay. It is not necessarily a primary gunfighter, but it can force face-to-face rolls through because you have an engineer to repair it if it takes damage. It is durable. You can just kind of keep making those rolls until you win. And any piece with 6/4 move, Silhouette 6 for a bit of vaulting, and access to that kind of a template can take up like positions that abuse enemy clumps. It's very easy, if your opponent has clustered models, to find those openings with the Stigmata. Because it's durable, because it has remote presence, it's very solid as both an ARO. Like, you don't want to put this thing out until it's dead, and it does have religious, so be careful about that. But you can use this to take some opportunistic AROs to disincentivize enemy warbands from taking their impetuous orders, for example, and then start rolling whip once you begin taking hits to pull back into cover. Again, risky. I've certainly seen those whip rolls fail over time and leave your tag standard, but it is an option. And then again, in active turn, BS13, burst 3 is not under normal circumstances great, but when you can keep trying until you succeed is totally good enough. And a damage 15 continuous impact template, i.e. ignoring the armor penalty, armor bonus from cover, is very effective. So it is in total a serviceable tag that is also a hacker, and it's a hacker that is really very difficult to push through. Yes, you can Trinity this thing to death, but it has ECM Hacker -3 and BTS 6 and 3 structure, which means that even something like an Anathematic, just rolling in on it, like if the Anathematic tries to walk into your repeater network, the Stigmata's probably going to make it through the turn a fair bit of the time. It might struggle to land hits back on the Anathematic, although the ECM goes a long way there, particularly if there's a firewall penalty at play. But just having that ECM Hacker -3 and the BTS and the structure means that, yes, you can Trinity a Stigmata down, but like, it is not easy to do so in an efficient way. And if you just have some regular old, but like a regular old Whip 13 hacker, you can be there all day trying to deal with this thing. You have to get a repeater onto it, and then you have to really spend the orders, and it takes time. Coming in at only 58 points, that is just super cool. And the fact that it's not the pilot, it's the Stigmata that is the hacker, means it's the Stigmata that is the specialist, which also just randomly makes it a super mobile freaking specialist. 6/4 specialist is awesome. The Stigmata also gives you access to one of the best duos in Bakunin, and like by best, I mean cool and interesting and effective, which is the Stigmata can duo with an Orphan of the Observance. Now, you will usually be duoing with one of the two engineer profiles. Option 1 is 18 points for an engineer submachine gun decharges with Mimetism 3, ballistic skill 12. The submachine gun pairs relatively nicely with the loadout of the Stigmata if you want to actually take gunfights rather than just impose templates at short range. The Orphan of the Observance is a serviceable gunfighter at that range, but really what it is an engineer to repair, just literally to staple to the Stigmata and just repair it whenever it takes damage. And then the spicier option is to take all of the same stuff, but also you get EM mines and a repeater on the Orphan of the Observance to move around with the Stigmata. Now, the Stigmata often will just kind of be in a fire-based position, but sometimes it will move out. But it does have that tactical awareness order every single turn, which you can use, if nothing else, just to slowly reposition that Orphan and move that repeater into, the midfield or a blocking position. Any hacker that can move a repeater along with it opens up some very interesting plays in terms of things like not just counter hacker options, but just generally having a very wide hacking area inside a single action. It's expensive. The 23 points for the Orphan is something that's definitely a sometimes food, but as far as duos go, it's a very cool and very interesting one. While we're talking about tags, the lizard is also it's the most tag of tags. Of all of the tags, it is one of them. It's doing absolutely nothing special and absolutely nothing wrong. 72 points for either of the multi-HMG profiles gives you exactly what you expect. I am always a proponent of, if you can, including a little bit of spec fire in lists, and the Lizard Squadron does that ably. It is just totally fine. It has ECM Hacker, which is nice. It's a ballistic skill 14 big gun platform with plenty of armor. There is nothing wrong with it whatsoever. It's really just a question in Bakunin of finding the points and SWC for it if it's something that you want. It does have a couple of more discounted profiles with shock AP Spitfires, and then again the mix of either grenade launchers or heavy flamethrowers, with EM mines on that one, which is kind of cool. I would doubt it does a ton of work, but it's kind of a nice to have. But even with all of the smoke that you have in Bakunin, I'm a little skeptical of using the Lizard as anything other than a big HMG platform. If you want to close into shorter ranges, Bakunin has just a ton of options for that. Nevertheless, 68 points for all of the resiliency of an Armor 8 BTS 6 main battle tag is thoroughly worthwhile, so I'm not going to talk down about either of these. They're cool, and the models I personally quite like. Tags are just generally very good in Infinity and 4, and the Lizard is a tag. Finally, brief note to Reverend Superior Cassandra Kusanagi. I wouldn't have mentioned her, but Rob called her out specifically in the notes that he sent me through, where he refers to her basically as the one-woman fire team. And that's a pretty fair take. She has no wound incapacitation and shock immune. She's ballistic skill 14 with mimetism 6, which is a very able gunfighter, and she is a specialist operative. She's also medium infantry and a character, which opens up a ton of classified options, which means that, yeah, she can kind of just do everything if you need her to. The challenge, of course, is finding the points or the SWC. None of those profiles are cheap. Like, 39 points for the multi-rifle EM grenade launcher is certainly interesting, but at that point, I feel like you are probably slotting her into a core link. She counts as a Reverend for the purposes of Reverend fire teams, which is the important one. I may, by the way, have been referring to Observance fire teams. Technically speaking, those are Haris teams. They're a different thing. Never mind. Assume I was talking about Reverend. So you can get a Ballistic Skill 17 Spec Fire EM grenade launcher, which is filth, frankly, but it's also 39 points in a team full of other expensive things. So you do get what you pay for there, but certainly a very solid and spicy choice. Now, the last piece that Rob wanted me to mention is the Meteor Zond. The Meteor Zond is a combat jump slash parachutist model with a repeater. And look, these are definitely a sometimes food, but I know Rob, and this is one of his favorite things to try to make work on the regular, and he absolutely does. Typically, you will use this parachuting on far more often than trying to land it with Fizz 11, because you are not taking an Evo hacker just to give this thing the chance to land on 14. So you walk this thing off the table once there's an opening to do so, but when you do, it's 6-4 move, and because it's 6-4 move, it's typically one move away from doing something very effective, even if that is just putting down a repeater area in an area your opponent thought you couldn't get a repeater area into. At only 22 points, it is definitely affordable, although for beginner Bakunin players, I would recommend you come to this thing once you are ready to try some interesting and experimental stuff, not because it's really super good on its own merits, but it is very cool. Now, rounding this episode out, as we roll into the 1 hour mark, we have a list that Rob has sent through for me to showcase at the end of this faction focus, and this, I believe from the name, is one of the lists that he took to CanCon 2024. This is a mixed Riot Girl and Observance fire team. In particular, as far as I can tell, it's running kind of interestingly a 4-person fire team for the Observance. So the Reverend team is not going for the full +2 ballistic skill bonus from the 5th composition bonus, but it's going to be ballistic skill 12 with the HRL on the Cenobite, which you really at that point are banking on mimetism 6 to kind of just make you unengageable. But by freeing up that 3rd slot and those points, there's a lot that you can accomplish. So this 4-person fire team, I think, is particularly cool, and it is definitely built around info war presence because we have a lieutenant hacking device Reverend Custodia, and then a decoy lieutenant hacking device Reverend Custodia, which is firstly a ton of network protection with those 2 pitches and a ton of hacking, and one of the most interesting ways to avoid having to spend 2 combat group slots on moderators, basically that I have seen in Bakunin. We then have the 2 Cenobites, which are outstanding. If the HRL goes down, you can recover her, and you have the other Cenobite for close assault. This list has basically zero fat, and then we have the fire team that I mentioned before, which is Avicenna, Fiddler, and the Riot Girl. So this Spitfire covers off on the remaining gunfighting that you need, and it's all of your force reconstitution that you might possibly want with both Avicenna and Fiddler. Anything in this list can be recovered by that team. We then have a Transductors on, just for some network projection. We have a Zellenkrieger and a Morlock. You can see that the Zellenkrieger has the heavy pistol, which makes it better for better for actual CC, whereas the Morlock has the assault pistol, which gives it a range option. And I particularly like that as having like multiple of these. And then in Combat Group 2, we have a Vertigozond, it's Nomads, put missile launchers in your Nomad list if you have network projection. It is just too useful a tool not to have. Otherwise, in this combat group, we have Den McConnelly and a Zellenkrieger, a 0 KHD, Robin Hook, and a Vertigozond. So we've got just the one camouflage marker in this list, but it is concealing a Killer Hacker, which is a midfield specialist, and I think this is something that Rob in particular likes, and I do agree with him here. If you are going to have a killer hacker, having a killer hacker that your opponent can't immediately jump on makes it more difficult for your opponent to dominate the info war early. It means that you have that back pocket tool for when you get to your active turn to return the favor and go after their hackers. And in a faction like Bakunin, which is vulnerable to losing the info war game, having that equalize the playing field option I think is very smart. Otherwise, Robin Hook pairs with the pitches to give you plenty of network projection. You have multiple with 14 hackers, you have plenty of gunfighting, and we're using Den McConnelly here just because we have 3 other irregular troops, and given Rob's comments on the command token budget in Bakunin, he makes a lot of sense in this particular context. So we have basically 0 fat. The only thing in this list that might be said not to fight is the Transductors, and it is 7 points, a regular order, and a repeater in your deployment zone. Literally everything else in the entire list does something, and it does something meaningful. It throws smoke, it assaults at close range, it fights in close combat, it fights at range, it hacks, it lands missiles, it presses buttons. This is an intensely well-rounded list, and it is no surprise to me that Rob did well with this. So, huge thanks again to Rob for providing a bunch of notes for this episode for me to talk to. I have some experience with Bakunin, but it's all playing against them, certainly not from the perspective of a Bakunin player. I think I've played with Bakunin perhaps once in N4. And big thanks again to, I think I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but I'll continue to do so, Cybernite, spelled Nijnte, for the request that led to this video. As a reminder, if you want to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member. Thanks to everyone who has so far. I take requests for battle reports, armies, scenarios, and faction coverage for Faction Focus, as well as just general, do you have questions about a list? Would you like some feedback on what you're playing? Do you want to do some basic dojo? I love doing list construction. I love providing options and feedback and talking about the things that people are playing. You can do that either via the Buy Me a Coffee page, by tagging me on the main Infinity Discord, or in the comment section of any of these videos. As always, I hope that you enjoyed this, and I'll be back soon with more.